Well, it began, at least my fascination with the JFK cold case. It went back till starting in 1973. My father took me through. We were stationed in Fort Hood, Texas, so he took me to the Texas Theater. He took me to all the sites, Daily Plaza, and it began just that many years ago. So it's been about a good 30-year look into what I think about that JFK cold case, how it changed so many lives, and I just sort of became, so invested in wanting to see as much as the truth as I could bring to it come out, and of course all the other, famous authors, whose work that I cite as well. That included Jim Marrs, Steve Revell, Claudia Furiati, and Tom Hartman, Lamar, Waldron, just to name a few. And I wanted to put an amalgamated journey for, people to get a good context of, what happened in the past and what is happening in the future, and how the impact of the Kennedy assassination has changed the way we here in America have to view history. So I wanted to put a new light on that history, and that's what this book is all about. So I hope you enjoy it. One of the stories that struck me and just hit me right, in the heart. This again goes along with the theme of the terrible sinking feeling that we were talking about, that Janet over at Ixtlan gave us permission to use from the JFK Extras DVD. That was a story that was related to me by the daughter of the great film director, Victor Fleming. And she told the story how she was in New York at the time of the assassination, and she was staying at the Brownstone House where they filmed Breakfast at Tiffany's, the Truman Capote piece, and directed by Blake Edwards. And of course, one of the things you do in New York is you got to go ice skating at Rockefeller Center. So she was ice skating at Rockefeller Center. It was that cool, crisp November evening, just before Thanksgiving, and she said that while she was going around and the news of the assassination broke, that ice skating, all the flags descended at Rockefeller Center, and sort of the music and everything stops, and it just continues on with that theme of how for this country and at that time and that place all across the world, it was that Gone with the Wind kind of a moment, and it just sort of took your breath away. It just went straight through. And I remember when she told me that story, and I was just so moved that I thought I had to share it with you guys here to remind everybody that this is about a terrible loss for our country. JFK was planning to start us on the road and the curve to a peace race as opposed to an arms race, and that elevated and alerted people in the military-industrial complex. There was going to be some upcoming wing clipping, and there were certain war hawks and generals and members of the Central Intelligence Agency that decided that they had to stop this young and forward-thinking president. And that's why David Talbot wrote the book, The Devil's Chessboard, and he concludes that Allen Dulles helped engineer, along with rogue factions of the CIA, agents involved in a conspiracy to murder John F. Kennedy, November 22nd, 1963. The Kennedy assassination has its official photographic record. One of the best experts in the Kennedy cold case is Robert J. Grodin's book called The Killing of the President. And in the book I wrote called Beachcomber, I reference some of these photographs. And if you open it up, you can see right away some of the doctors and other witnesses that we talked about in the Kennedy cold case, talking about the head wound, saying that Kennedy was shot from the front. It includes Beverly Oliver, Ed Hoffman.
And I was taking pictures with my film, with my camera, which was an 8mm movie camera. And the nightmare happened.
My dad had stopped on Simmons Freeway beyond those trees. He had stopped there to see the Kennedy motorcade go by.
It had turned the corner, and as it came right down, as it got toward me, it came over into this lane, and I jumped back up on the curb, and his head was blown off right in front of me.
When there was a bang, and we all said, was that a shot? What was that? What was that? And there was that amount of time to say that. Then there were two bang, bang, like that, very close together. And I was right at the front of the press box, and I said, Jesus, those are shots.
So the most important thing that we're discussing, we just watched the people who were there that day in De La Plaza, November 22nd, 1963. And, you know, it's important to have precision in your witnesses' testimony. And one of the most clear and concise portraits of that, you just heard it, Robert McNeil from the McNeil-Lehrer report. He said there was a bang, and then there was a bang, bang, just like that. So these are the 6 seconds that we're talking about in Dallas. The thesis of my book and others that are out there is that shot cadence was also in unison with, you know, two shooting teams that were firing. And I believe, along with numerous others, there were at least 9 to 11 shots that were fired on that day in history. And the best way to describe that is we know that Governor Connolly had 3 wounds, you know, places where he was struck by bullets and either fragments of bullets, and he had a wound in 3 places. We know Kennedy had a wound in the front of the throat. We know that he was hit in the temple when his head was blown off, and we know he was shot from behind in the back. So there were 3 wounds in Kennedy and in Connolly. And then we also know that through Robert Groden, who's the photographic expert, and also the testimony of Dr. Evalia Glanges, who was a doctor on duty at Parkland Hospital, that there was also a bullet shot that went through the front windshield from the front to the back. This was reported by Douglas Weldon along with the Dr. Evalia Glanges. And this was seen by Secret Servicemen, and this is a particular car, SS-100X, the limousine that JFK had. It was taken to the Ford factory, and it was later stripped and broken down.
We ran around the side of the building to the emergency room exit, and the presidential limousine was there. Had been staying there for some time, just watching the back of the emergency room, when I realized that there was a bullet hole in the windshield. Talked to my friend next to me and said, "Look, there's a bullet hole in the windshield," and pointed it out to them. At the time, I did not know any of the details of the shooting. I was quite shocked when I looked up and saw the bullet hole, but it was very clear. It was a through and through bullet hole through the windshield of the car from the front to the back. I don't believe there's even any cracks associated with that bullet hole. It seemed like a high velocity bullet that had penetrated from front to back in that glass pane. At which point a security officer of some type raced forward and jumped in the limousine and drove it off even as I was leaning against it to an area back of us somewhere. And that was the last time I saw the limousine.
And then we know, along with those shots, that there were 2 bullets that missed. One was missed to the back of the car, and the other bullet that was shot that was lodged inside the top frame of the limousine. So if you add all those up, there's definitely more than 3 bullets. It's more like 9 bullets and possibly 11 shots. And we know that the final bullet that struck a curbstone and a fragment of a bullet came up and struck James Tague. So if you add the wounds to Connolly and Kennedy and also to Tague, that's 3 and 3 and 1, that's 7. And then we have 2 that missed, and then 1 that went through the front windshield. Bullet went through the front windshield, and then 1 that missed that's to the back of the car. And you add those numbers up, and it's definitely more than 3 shots that were fired. The follow-up to the shots cadence, again, it's very much discussed. There are over 5,000 conspiracy books that are out there. Even popular American politicians like Jesse Ventura released his book called American Conspiracies with his co-author Dick Russell. And one of the first things that he discusses that, basically got him wound up, the Nixon tapes, where Richard Nixon says on tape in this book, according to this book, he says, with regard to the Warren Commission report, he states unequivocally, Nixon does on tape, he says, it's the greatest hoax that was ever perpetuated on the American people. So when you add the shots cadence to what Jesse Ventura and witnesses like Bill Newman had said about the assassination, and Bill Newman was the closest witness, by the way, to the Grassy Knoll shooter or the shooting team. And basically he ducks down along with his wife and his 2 children because shots are whizzing past over the top of his head coming up from Grassy Knoll. And William Newman, states unequivocally that there were several shots fired from the Grassy Knoll. And that's what gets all these, authors wound up, including politicians like Jesse Ventura, about the crime of the century, to indicate that there was a second shooter or shooting team that was operating from the Grassy Knoll. And here you see the Kennedy brothers. What they represented was a dynasty that a lot of people feared, because they knew if Jack was going to be a 2-term president, that Bobby was going to be right behind him, and possibly Teddy after that. So essentially this could represent, the next 24 years of the presidency could be owned by the Kennedy brothers. And there were people who had powerful interests that were at stake that did not want to see the presidency fall under the Kennedy brothers' stewardship for the next 25 years. And here is the very highly suspicious note that no assassin would dare write. If you're an unknown assassin, you do not write. This note says, "Dear Mr. Hunt," but it's from Lee Oswald. It's to E. Howard Hunt of the CIA. And here Oswald is written in his own handwriting, note dated November 8, 1963. And it's signed by Lee Harvey Oswald, addressed to E. Howard Hunt of the CIA. And in it, Oswald is saying, "I would like to request information concerning my position, and I'm only asking for information, and I'm suggesting that the matter be fully discussed before any steps are taken by me, myself, or anyone else. Thank you, Lee Harvey Oswald. So this is the mark of a man 2 weeks before the Kennedy assassination. This is the mark of a man who doesn't know versus a man who knows. This is a man who's caught up in the intrigue of an event that is bigger than he is, and which he's not so sure that he wants to carry out the rest of the CIA, what Jim Garrison called the CIA sheep dipping, which meant that he had to go through certain step processes and certain jobs to earn his wings to be a covert operator in the top level of the CIA operation. And so again, this is key information about the JFK cold case from the book The Killing of the President.
Allen Dulles, fired by Kennedy as CIA director, was a key commissioner and the strongest advocate of its theory that Oswald acted alone. He kept silent about covert CIA activities that might have had a bearing on the case.
I can't understand it. As I looked over the Warren Report, I read your testimony in the Warren Report, both of you. Both of you said that no question that Oswald is the one that shot Jack, that the bullet came up there. Well, he said, the reason we testified that way, said to Kenny, is that the FBI came to us and said, let's get this behind us. You're wrong. There had been an echo. That was an echo you heard. Both you and Dave are wrong in this. The family would like to get the thing behind it. There's no question that it was only one shot. And he said, I went along with the FBI, and they said exactly what the FBI wanted us to say, and Dave said exactly the same thing.
Few in the president's inner circle saw it coming. 90 days into the term, they were all still filled with the euphoria of simply making it to the White House.
A new president is still feeling rather heady. He's won the presidency. He's on top. He's got the magic touch. He can't lose. That's a very dangerous feeling to have when you're president.
Dangerous because it can result in poor judgment. In Kennedy's case, it did. He'd been presented with a plan targeting Fidel Castro and Cuba, a plan that had seemed so plausible. It had been hatched by the CIA and endorsed by President Eisenhower in his last months in office. A covert operation that would remove Castro, restore American influence over the Caribbean, and project Kennedy as a man of action and accomplishment.
This young president was presented with recommendations of the chiefs and the CIA and President Eisenhower's plan to go ahead with this, I'll call it harebrained scheme to overthrow Castro.
This footage of Kennedy going into the cabinet room to greet the Joint Chiefs on the afternoon of February 20th was taken by filmmaker Robert Drew. He'd been given unprecedented access to capture a day at the White House for a television documentary.
They'll have an amphibious landing on the beach, and then tomorrow they have a strike exercise, carrier strike exercise, and then they will be taken down to Panama. Other countries are represented. All but Cuba.
Those remarks were not included in the original broadcast. What you just heard was part of a classified briefing dealing with secret military exercises being conducted in preparation for a possible invasion of Cuba. Over the next 2 months, Kennedy would listen intently as invasion advocates stressed the importance of following through with the plan Eisenhower had endorsed. Kennedy felt the generals were testing him, trying to determine whether he had the courage to be an effective commander-in-chief.
I think it's terribly important to remember that he was a lieutenant in the Naval Reserves, and he was talking to admirals with so much gold on there, and generals and all of this, that he was impressed by that. And they were naturally unimpressed with him.
The CIA had devised 2 separate schemes to be run simultaneously. In Central America, it was training 1,500 Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and spark an uprising. At the same time, the CIA was trying to kill Castro. Robert Mayhew, a former senior FBI agent, was recruited to coordinate the assassination.
I met with Chef Edwards and Jim O'Connell, who were my contacts within the CIA. They told me that they were planning on a program to assassinate Fidel Castro, and that they knew I had a contact with the mafia. They felt that they were the logical ones to take on this kind of assignment.
But did Kennedy know about the CIA plans to assassinate Castro, and that they'd recruited known mafia figures to carry out the assignment?
We don't know for sure. What we do know is that Kennedy had a personal relationship with Richard Bissell. And Richard Bissell was the action officer for these Cuban operations in the beginning. Did Bissell tell him about the assassination plots? He was too smart a man to talk details. Did he signal to Kennedy that we are looking at all options to get rid of this thorn in our sides out there in Cuba? I think so.
By the time Kennedy was inaugurated, Mayhew had set up at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami and recruited two leading mafia figures to assist in the assassination of Castro, Sam Giancana from Chicago and Johnny Roselli from Miami.
The first hope was that it could be done by assassination via firearms. Giancana reported back that he could not find anyone who had the tenacity or the willingness to get involved in such a situation. At which time the CIA came up with the plan of a poison pill. Giancana reported subsequently that his contact at the last minute had, I believe it was a female, because he claimed that she had lost her courage to go through with the plan.
By the beginning of April, CIA officials were giving up hope that Castro's death would precede the invasion. They nevertheless pressed Kennedy to launch the attack. The military supported the mission. Kennedy and his new team felt reluctant to challenge the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
I've only been there less than 90 days. Many of us didn't know very much about it, were inexperienced in such situations. In any event, weren't enthusiastic about it. Dean Rusk and I, in particular, had questions on our mind, but we didn't say no. Not a single one of President Kennedy's members of the executive branch advised against it.
Kennedy was insistent that the CIA role be hidden. The assassination and the landing of the exiles had to be seen as a local uprising. Cubans overthrowing Castro, not the U.S. removing a communist threat. Anything else would invite Soviet intervention against American interests elsewhere.
He then fell prey to some of the plan's advocates, accepted the plan, accepted it full of cautions and ambivalence. The cautions and ambivalence took a plan that was already very risky and problematical and doomed it to almost certain failure.
On April 15th, 8 B-26s, flying from a CIA-controlled airstrip in Nicaragua, bombed 3 Cuban airfields. But the surprise attack was no surprise at all to Castro. The outlines of the supposedly secret plan had been known in Havana for weeks. Castro ordered air batteries to be manned around the city. He stifled opposition by throwing 20,000 people in prison. The CIA's plan was doomed before the first troops landed at the Bay of Pigs. For 2 days, the exiles were pinned down along the Bay of Pigs, battling against overwhelming odds. They had been promised American air cover, but it never arrived. They'd also been told that if they encountered strong resistance from Castro's forces, they should head to the mountains and regroup. The CIA had failed to mention that the mountains were 80 miles away across a mosquito-infested swamp. The operation was later to be described by the CIA as a perfectly executed failure.
So the plot thickens. You've got the CIA is running a false flag operation. You got planes landing in Miami, in Key West, and in Jacksonville. Jacksonville is the real defector, but the other 2 planes are exposed as fakes. So right away, reporters catch up to this hoax, and the first person to catch this heat, this extreme heat, is there's an uproar at the UN. Valerian Zorin, who's the Soviet ambassador, he threatens that Cuba has many friends in the world, and the Soviet Union, who will come to her aid in the event that she's being attacked. And America tries to deny that this operation is a CIA-based attack. So McGeorge Bundy told General Cabell not to fly the airplanes until they could operate them off the beachhead. So what he's saying, in a sense, is in order for this to work, I need you to cancel the dawn airstrikes for the morning and do not fly them until you can operate and have those planes take off from a landing strip within Cuba. Now, the entire plan is based on getting these last 3 planes destroyed. And with this phone call, McGeorge Bundy literally, cripples the CIA operation right at the start. And so basically, the brigade lands at the beach on the 18th. Castro's planes are still active. They end up wrecking havoc, destroying the supply ships, and the entire CIA plan is destroyed. And it took like 18 years later until McGeorge Bundy, did an article in the New York Times where he took full responsibility for the plan's failure. So McGeorge Bundy, by not flying this airstrike, the dawn airstrike, and not canceling it to where it could be flown from within the beachhead in Cuba, is what caused the entire plan's failure. Not John Kennedy. John Kennedy ordered the final 3 planes destroyed, but McGeorge Bundy reversed that order through General Cabell, and he ended up causing the entire CIA plan, the Bay of Pigs, to disintegrate, fall apart, and fail.
Before he died, Johnson told another journalist, "We had been operating a murder incorporated in the Caribbean, which leads to conspiracy theory number 3, linking the assassination to elements in the CIA and its anti-Castro crusade."
I would say that we're going to find the assassins of John Kennedy somewhere in the vicinity of a CIA operations directorate that had mobilized the anti-Castro Cuban community.
The assault has begun on the dictatorship of Fidel Castro.
This is the event that turned Cuban exiles against Kennedy, the CIA's disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in 1961. Planned by the Eisenhower administration, Kennedy reluctantly pursued the invasion, but refused at the last minute to provide air support.
Kennedy blamed the CIA for the failure of the Bay of Pigs. There were many in the CIA and many in the military who blamed Kennedy's refusal to directly use American air power for that failure.
Crushed by the Cuban army, the right-wing exiles were furious and vowed revenge. At that time, Perry Russo supported the Cuban exiles in New Orleans and still voices the sense of betrayal that they felt.
I share the view that the direction of the federal government in 1963 was completely anti-American. That we had stabbed the Cubans in the back. What else were we going to allow to happen to this country before we stood up?
We intend to profit from this lesson. We intend to re-examine and reorient our forces of all kinds.
If the Cubans saw Kennedy as their enemy, JFK began to see the CIA as his.
Later on, there was a newspaper headline, the New York Times, a sub-headline, Kennedy Bitterness, which quoted Kennedy as saying, "I'm going to take the CIA, break it into 1,000 pieces, and cast the pieces into the winds." They were finished.
But Kennedy had played their game too, presiding over coup and assassination attempts against foreign leaders. Could these same tactics blow back and be used against him?
The strongest motive to kill somebody is self-defense. And these intelligence officers were the same intelligence officers who had been participating in plots to assassinate Castro, Lumumba, the DM brothers, Papa Doc Duvalier, world leaders that they didn't agree with all around the country, all around the world. So is it any stretch of the imagination that in their fear and in self-defense that they simply sent their hit squads to Dallas?
The three tramps, or the hobos that were arrested in Dealey Plaza, if you flip to the Osvaldo Salas book, you can see here they are going home, and you can see that this tramp here, this one turns his back to the camera, but you can see that they're the same people. I'll see if I can flip it so you can see it. So here's one. Here he is being arrested November 22nd, 1963, and there he is. He's on the tarmac. He's one of the CIA Bay of Pigs prisoners as he's going home. You can see it's the same guy, as is this guy right here. This is one of the only differences. This guy turns his head to the camera. So you can see the connection from the Bay of Pigs prisoners of war in Castro's Cuba versus the three tramps who were photographed in Dealey Plaza.
Oh, come on. Did the mob get the Warren Commission appointed to cover it up? Mob wouldn't have the guts or the power for something of this magnitude. Assassins need payrolls, schedules, times, orders. This was a military-style ambush from start to finish. This was a coup d'etat with Lyndon Johnson waiting in the wing.
So after the Zapata report, that's when John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy decided that after that report was concluded, that they would take control over the CIA. And one of the first things that came out was the result of that was, memo number 55, National Security Action Memorandum 55. And that was where JFK personally informs the Joint Chiefs of Staff that from now on it will be the military jurisdiction will take over these covert operations, and the CIA will be removed from the playing field. And this is right where Bobby Kennedy becomes his brother's #1 alliance and his #1 confidant, and the CIA is taken off the playing field. In essence, JFK is removing their teeth, is taking the CIA off the playing field. And this memo 55, more than any other reason that I can think of, the result of the Bay of Pigs disaster, Kennedy vows never to be embarrassed again, and he says, I'm going to take the CIA and I'm going to cast, it into the four winds. I'm going to literally blow it apart. They were through. So basically, in a nutshell, the Bay of Pigs disaster, Richard Bissell's plan, right there in the Zapata report, JFK is sitting in front of the former CIA director, Walter Beadle Smith, and the current CIA director, Allen Dulles, and he tells them point blank, covert operations are going to be taken away from CIA. And then 2 months later, June 28th, Memo 55 comes out. And that's when the CIA knew that they were through. The old Joe Kennedy philosophy that he taught both his sons, don't get mad, get even. And JFK was going to get even for the Bay of Pigs. And he took the CIA out of covert operations. And this is what led to, in my opinion, in my viewpoint, in the viewpoint of others, Oliver Stone, Fletcher Prouty, Claudio Furiati in ZR Rifle, Jim Mars in Crossfire, to believe that this, more than anything, is the reason why Kennedy was killed. When I encounter writers, other writers who have, been to Vietnam or military people, one of the first, influences that I see in the books that I'm reading particularly like L. Fletcher Prouty, who wrote JFK, the CIA in Vietnam. And he mentions a Melville phrase in that. And what it is I wanted to make sure that I was able to put a broad spectrum approach. I wanted to take some of the best writers from going way back, and then some of the current writers, some of my film writers that influenced me.
The final theory, number 5, involves the military-industrial complex. It is the controversial thesis of Oliver Stone's film that Kennedy may have been killed to stop him from stopping the war in Vietnam.
There's no question in my mind whatsoever that John Kennedy would never have committed combat troops to a war in Southeast Asia. Never.
I spent much of September '63 working on the Kennedy plan for getting all U.S. personnel out of Vietnam by the end of 1965. This plan was one of the strongest, most important papers issued from the Kennedy White House.
The Mr. X character in JFK, played by Donald Sutherland, is based in part on this man, Colonel Fletcher Prouty.
At the time of the Kennedy assassination, I was the Chief of Special Operations in the Joint Staff, working for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Special Operations in those days was a euphemism for the military support of the clandestine operations of CIA around the world.
Prouty was an insider who claimed that while some in the Pentagon were gearing up for war, he was secretly helping President Kennedy plan for peace.
But during the summer, July, August, and September, he had a very experienced group of people work on his new policy for Vietnam. It was published in October, and it was called the National Security Action Memorandum number 263. And that memorandum, signed under the direction of the President, was to bring men home by Christmas and get everybody out by 1965.
What we're looking at here are approximately 15,000 pages of documents on Kennedy's Vietnam policies that I've collected from all the archives in the United States. In some cases, and many of them are newly declassified.
In a new book, JFK and Vietnam, military historian Major John Newman offers his conclusions about Kennedy's Vietnam policy.
I don't think there's any doubt that JFK was pulling out of Vietnam when he was killed. And I think because the most fundamental tenet of his policy was no combat troops, and we know that Johnson put in combat troops, I feel it's safe to say that the assassination led directly to the escalation of the war.
Gentlemen, I want you to know I'm not going to let Vietnam go like China did. I'm personally committed. And I'm not going to take one soldier out of there till they know we mean business in Asia.
Did that policy change after the assassination?
Only 4 days later.
What happened?
4 days later, under Lyndon Johnson, they issued a new National Security Action Memorandum, number 273, which began a modest change. Then in March of '64, another memorandum, 288, began the attacks on North Vietnam and the escalation of the war.
And in my last conversation with him, I'll always remember it, he said, as soon as the election is over, I'm going to get the boys out of Vietnam. To myself, I've always said there would have been never that great disaster that we had, the loss of lives that he had.
It's just a special thank you, and some of our heroes that helped us along in the journey. And I want to start out with Damian Marquise Thompson, our filmmaker, filmed the project, putting all this film together. My best friend for the last 35 years, Joseph Steinberg. My editor, Leslie Sears, who carved out 16 months of her life to make this happen. Along with the notables, David Milch, Dale Neal, Crystal Neal, David Ward, Peter Nelson, John Richards, Luann Richards, Kim Selby, Rick Selby, Patty Cantrell. This book would not have been possible without their support. And of course the Sklar family, which is Leon Sklar and Ron Sklar, and of course Rick Sklar, who's no longer with us. And just a very special shout out to Sam Rubin, Leslie Rubin, and Julie Anderson. And also I want to thank Elliot Gold, who saw some of this footage. And we want you to know that all of your support and everyone who supported this project, it is appreciated from a very, very, a very good place. And, one of the last credits that I almost overlooked are some of the new friends that I've encountered in this journey. And I guess I want to give a special thanks to Renee Zellweger, who offered her encouragement, and Raul Pedraza for his support. And I want to thank Barack Obama, who opened up U.S. and Cuba relations. And everybody, as soon as you get the chance, book your next holiday. It's I'm on my way to Havana by the time you see this. And I appreciate your heart and soul for allowing me to be a part of your life and share this experience with you. And so we want to remind everybody that the website that you will go to will be www.michaelgering.weebly.com, and that is where you can pick up the book, and you can check out the new second edition of The Beachcomber, which should be out by July 20th. And we hope you enjoy the book. Thank you. Well, we're talking about book reaction, and I have film writer friends, and I have just author, book writer friends. So one of the kindest reviews on an early draft of the book was from David Milch, who he described it as a very ambitious book. So that was very touching that one of my film writer friends described it as very ambitious. Coming from him, it just means all the world to me as a first-time author in a graphic novel. Peter Nelson, he was my British Academy Award-winning friend. He just said it was very impressive. I guess he admired the full context and the scope. After I told him it was 25 or 30 years of research, he was very kind and said it was very impressive. And John Schwada was on the end of that, the famous Fox reporter. He said it was a very unusual book, so we got some individuality in there. And then of course my dear friend Chris Knopf of the famous Knopf publishing family, he was also very encouraging with the project, because he talked about how many of his writer friends that he knew in this business that had turned to self-publishing, and he was the one that said, Mike, whatever you do, he said, go ahead and follow that dream, because he said a lot of his writer friends, and he's from a very prestigious publishing family, and he said most of the writers that he knew had moved toward self-publishing. So we wanted to talk about the publishing world
versus self-publishing. Self-publishing world and the publishing world, and how these two intersect. I had mentioned to you earlier that through the wonderful place where I work, I was able to meet George Carlin, one of the greatest comedians of this or any generation. He passed away a little while ago. And I told him about my difficulties with the publishing world, and I explained it to him. I said, there is a difficulty in combining 3 books into one book. And George Carlin always encouraged me. He was very supportive. And he would say to me, something along the lines of, if you've read some of his books in the freestyle atmosphere that he's into in his comedic writing, he would mention to me how he would say, and I can't do his voice, but he would say, Mike, if it's up there in my head and I can get it down on paper, like that, it stays in there. He would always say something along the lines of, whatever is up in there that you're thinking and you're feeling, you should be able to impart that, down on the page. And so, of course, the publishing world is a much more restrictive format. And in the publishing world, the books have to have a more of a traditional sense of the beginning, the middle, the end. And at any rate, if you're going to combine 3 books into one book, the long and the short of it, we ended up having to go, instead of a publisher, we went to self-publishing. And in self-publishing, I met a wonderful, supportive company. The company is called Rounds and Miller Associates. It's run by a gentleman named Mike Rounds, a former Marine. And I sat in on a seminar with him, and he was the one that introduced me to self-publishing. And once we got going, once payment was made and contract was set, I met this wonderful editor named Leslie Sears out of Hawaii. And Leslie Sears was sort of the genius who took an 11-month period to take the best of what was in these 3 books in one book and did this marvelous, miraculous editing job to come up with our book, The Beachcomber, which the writers have been very, very kind. Friends of mine have been very, very kind, and I'm very, very pleased to bring about the second edition of this book. And some of the questions, forgive me for referring to these notes, but why there is a second edition. This crime of the century was literally 6 seconds in Dallas, and yet here we are 50 years later. People are writing about it and discussing it, and we've been talking about that same 6 seconds for over 50 years. So some of this material that is in this second edition was not available as we went to press. I had some help. My Harvard lawyer, Mr. Dale Neal, he was able to get some rights for me, so I had help from a Harvard lawyer and different law firms to help me secure the rights to material. So now the bigger, better version will be coming out. It's going to be July 20th of 2015, and we will have a new, bigger, better Beachcomber and a bigger, better version of the book that is, in my POV, point of view, is the Da Vinci Code on who killed John Kennedy.